You've probably read or heard that the Malaysian rainforest dates from about 130 million years and is one of the oldest in the world. But there are different perspectives and views on that. So I wanted to start off by pointing out differences of opinion and then trying to resolve them. Several years ago, someone in Sri Lanka asked the question, how old are the tropical forests worldwide? They posted this question on ResearchGate. If you're not familiar with ResearchGate, it's an internet forum where researchers can post topics and post their papers, their research. And it's also a place where they can ask questions. So this person is asking on ResearchGate for an answer of how old are the tropical rainforests worldwide. The response I've got underneath, if you look at this box, let's see if this works. Yeah, if you look at the box down here, is from a person called Robert Morley. And if you read that, I'm not going to read it to you. If you read it quickly, it basically says that in his view, the Malaysian rainforest is one of the youngest in the world. So right away, we have a bit of a disagreement here. Now, of course, the question is Robert Morley particularly well qualified to make that statement? So who is he? Well, he's an academic. He's a paleobotanist and geologist at the University of London. And around the year 2000, he wrote a tome, a massive textbook called The Origins and Evolution of the World's Tropical Rainforests. It's about 400 pages long, and at $1 a page, it's way too expensive for me to buy a copy. Fortunately, he's written numerous papers which are available online. We will keep mentioning him. I'll keep mentioning him as we go along. His name will keep cropping up. Another interesting perspective is very, very recent. I don't know if any of you are watching The Green Planet, the BBC's new episode available on Unify. But in the very first episode, which is about tropical forests, Sir David Attenborough says, the northernmost tip of Australia, this is the world's most ancient rainforest. So again, a different viewpoint. What I want to do to begin with, the first part of my talk, is to try and reconcile or to understand these different opinions. So let's move on. So I want, first of all, to try and understand the age of the rainforest. When did it start in the geological history of Malaysia? But I think much more importantly, I want to try and understand what has changed the rainforest. Why do the flora and fauna change through time? It has a very complex history, and I think that's the most important aspect. And that's what I really want to try and understand. Now, I really have to emphasize that my own field in geochemistry has got nothing to do with any of this. This is not my research area. So what I have been doing is a phrase that's become very popular during the pandemic is follow the science. Fortunately, my position at UBC gives me access through their electronic library to pretty well every peer-reviewed scientific journal published. So I'm being retired, I've got time. I spent a lot of time looking at quite an extensive literature that's come out over the last 2 decades, which is directly relevant to these questions. Now, obviously, I've chosen the papers I'm most interested in. I may have reached the wrong conclusions. I might misrepresent them. So on this first or second slide, I put a link. You'll find almost all the papers that I mention at that link, and you can either read them directly on that link on Google Drive, or you can download them as PDFs to read any place, any time. Each slide that I will show you, almost all of them are directly taken from those scientific papers, and the author's name and the year of publication, I've attributed it at the bottom of the slide. So you can track these things down. So let's start off with a very general textbook slide. First of all, what is a tropical rainforest? And then a map of where we find them. Well, tropical evergreen rainforests are found in hot and usually 18 degrees centigrade or thereabouts is taken as the minimum temperature, and wet, greater than 2,000 millimeters of rain per year. There shouldn't be any dry seasons ideally, but if there are any dry seasons, they should be less than 2 months long, and rainfall should not be less than 60 millimeters per rain per month. You often find the word per humid associated with tropical rainforests. It simply means forever humid. Again, it's an indication that they're not really meant to be seasonal, ideally. And also sometimes you'll see the word megathermal. That simply means that they're receiving large amounts of radiant energy. They're getting a lot of warmth from the sun. Okay, where do we find them? Well, here's a very simple textbook map. The main tropical rainforests are, of course, the Amazon, West Africa, and over here, Southeast Asia. And I just want to point out a few things which are not really directly relevant to the talk, but they do set the scene, and they're not immediately apparent from this slide. First of all, the Amazon and the West African rainforests are very much situated on stable cratons, very stable geological areas. They're very ancient. There is not much movement of the continental plates anymore. That is in direct contrast to this part of the world. Malaysia, Indonesia, this region are made up of plates that have come from many different places, and that process is still ongoing. Movement of plates is jostling everything around. And we've also got, obviously, we had an earthquake a few days ago in KL. There's active volcanism in Indonesia, in the islands. There are earthquakes. It's still tectonically quite active. That's very different to Amazonas and West Africa. The other thing is much more obvious on this slide. It's the length of the coastlines, the amount of maritime influence, if you like. I quickly looked it up on the internet. The coastline of Indonesia alone is about 100,000 kilometers. It's about 20 times greater than the coastlines of Amazonas and of the West African rainforest. And we know from the work of Wallace in Southeast Asia more than 100 years ago, and of Darwin in the Galapagos, that islands tend to result in speciation and diversity and encourage biodiversity to increase. Combine that with the maritime influence. Anything that changes the sea level, climate change, those kinds of things, is going to affect the islands and their size and extent, and that is going to affect the flora and fauna. So again, this strong maritime influence, which is especially strong in the case of Peninsular Malaysia, is something that's absent from the Amazon and from West Africa. Okay, let's move on to more detail. Okay, we're now looking at a stratigraphic column, a geological column of the rocks found in Peninsular Malaysia. And you can see that this is attributed to Metcalfe. He wrote the paper 2013. That is on that link that I mentioned at the beginning. Just as a point of historic influence, Metcalfe was for many years a professor at So he spent a lot of time in Malaysia. This stratigraphic column, the different geological periods in the left, runs from the Cambrian up to the Cretaceous, from the beginning of the Paleozoic to the end of the Mesozoic. The oldest rocks are the Cambrian rocks, which best place to see them is at the top of the chairlift in Langkawi. Almost all of that column from the Cambrian right the way through to the early Jurassic those rocks are formed from marine sediments. There were short intervals when sediments were not deposited. There might have been erosion and uplift, but predominantly throughout the geological column, it was marine. For example, in the Kinta Valley, we have the Kinta limestone that was deposited at the bottom of a tropical sea, a shallow tropical sea, over quite a time span in the middle towards the end of the Paleozoic. So think of most of this column as being marine. We then, in the lower Jurassic, let me see if I can make this work. Yeah, there, this line, it changes to orange, the color. There's a sudden, very important change. There's been uplift of land, and we're going to look at that in more detail in just a couple of minutes. This is the start of the continental history of Malaysia and Southeast Asia, when they became a landmass on the southern edge of the Eurasian landmass, of the Eurasian plate. And I'm going to point out again, while we've got this diagram on, that there are two columns, on the central one and one on the right. The center column is called Sayong beds at the top. That column is the details about what happened on the western side of the peninsula, on the rocks on the west. It's not the Sayong of Kledong Sayong Forest Reserve just outside Ipoh. Apparently there is a Sayong somewhere up in Kedah, and it's named after that Sayong. But the important thing is these rocks are continental. They are not marine. The column on the extreme right is for the central and eastern belts. I'll just combine it as one. They're the rocks on the eastern side of the peninsula. It says Eastern Belt, or East Malaysia, or East Malaya rather. Don't confuse that with Eastern Malaysia, with Sabah and Sarawak. It's not, it's just the eastern side of the peninsula. So what I want to do now is to take you through a few slides, which very quickly take us through that column, starting somewhere around, where's my pointer gone? Somewhere around here, and then going up. So first of all, I put in a text summary. So if I miss something out, you've got it in writing, you can read it. We're going to start at about 340 million years ago. And at that time, the seabed that ultimately became Malaysia, that little bit of the seabed, was in the southern hemisphere, close to the northern edge of Gondwana land, where there's a small bit of crust, which geologists call Sibu Masu. And as I said a few minutes ago, it was mostly submerged beneath the sea the whole time through until the Jurassic. And it's moving around the globe. It's shifting, it's continental drift, it's moving around. And it drifts and drifts and drifts until at about 200 million years ago, it starts to collide with the southern edge of more northern parts of Asia. And that causes the uplift of the new landmass that eventually becomes Southeast Asia. And Sibu Masu forms the western side of the peninsula. So let's look at that quickly in this series of maps. Here's the first one. Again, it's from Metcalfe. He did a lot of work on this topic when he was at UM. Here's Gondwana land. I should put my pointer on. There's Gondwana land. Here's Australia. Here's India. And this strip in here is Sibu Masu. The ocean that we see here is called Tethys. Another fragment of crust here is what will become Indochina and South China. And here's North China. These are their positions 340 million years ago. If we jump forward in time to 253 million years ago, don't worry about the threes. These numbers don't matter that much. There's a lot of errors in these. Cebu Maso is now here. A rift has developed in the Tethys. It's opening up in the same way that today the Atlantic is opening up and spreading. Tethys was opening up and spreading. And the land, or the crustal fragment that became this fragment in here, that became the western side of Peninsular Malaysia, is drifting northwards. Most of the time, it's still submerged, still underwater, accumulating marine sediments. Over here, we have a subduction zone. That's where the denser, deeper crust is going down. It's the same thing that's happening nowadays off the west coast of Sumatra, causing the earthquakes and volcanoes and so on. The sediments that formed the eastern side of Peninsular Malaysia were deposited there, just over that subduction zone. That was a subduction basin arc in here, where sediments are accumulating. So we find those sediments now, for example, in Kelantan, Terengganu, and Pahang, on the eastern side of the mountain range. If we go to the next map, Tethys is opened even further, and now this is at 200 million years approximately, and now Cebu Masu has actually collided. It's ridden over the, or into that arc, it's ridden over it, and it's now collided with Indochina. And we're starting to see a shape that very crudely resembles the shape of the present peninsula, this long elongated thing in here. One very, very important point when it comes to discussing the tropical rainforest and its age is notice the latitude. This line here is the equator. This new landmass, this new uplift, is a long way north of the equator. Malaysia as a landmass, or that part of what is now Malaysia and Thailand and so on, started off quite a long ways north. And I'm going to emphasize that with this slide. This slide is from by Japanese researchers who studied the position of Malaysia specifically at about late Jurassic, early Cretaceous, so about 180 million years ago, very roughly. And then again, they looked at it at 55 to 25 million years ago. And there's an outline in very pale colors of the present day geographic location. Here is Malaysia at about 17 degrees north instead of 4 degrees north, quite a long way north. And it's oriented more or less east-west. Whereas now, of course, the peninsula is oriented north-south, more or less. Now, I don't want to give you the impression it's just Malaysia that's done this. It's the whole of Southeast Asia. That whole block has moved. It's rotated. Why did it do that? Well, it did it because starting at about 55 million years, India started to move up from the south, and it pushed up against Asia and displaced everything. It caused rotation. So going from about 180 million years to 55 million years, Malaysia moves from here, it rotates clockwise, and it moves southwards to this position. Now, as we saw in that first slide, the tropical rainforest belt is largely equatorial, close to the equator. So Malaysia starts off, when it first emerges, a long way to the north. But over time, over geological time, from about 55 million years, it starts to rotate and move to the south. If you look very, very carefully at this diagram, you'll find that today that rotation is reversed. Malaysia is now moving very, very slightly in a counterclockwise direction. You can see that here. But it's a very small displacement. So that main thing to remember, let's go to the next slide, is that these rocks, these Siong beds and their equivalent on the eastern side of the peninsula, first of all, they're continental. And secondly, they were deposited in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous on a new land surface that was around 20 degrees north of the equator, not near the equator. The other thing to notice, and I'll come back to this in a few more minutes, a little bit later, is over in this column on the right-hand side, in here, it actually says there are some fossils. There's actually a flora, fossil flora. It's called the Ryoseki flora. I'm not a paleobotanist, but we are going to look at what scientists have said, researchers, about that flora in a few minutes' time. So here's just a summary. Cebu Masu moved from the northern edge of Gondwana during the Paleozoic. It accumulated marine sediments while it was submerged. A collision starting at 200 million years resulted in an uplift of a new landmass about 20 degrees north of the equator. Starting from about 180 million years, we got these Siong beds and their equivalent being deposited on that new land surface. They're not sea marine beds, they're continental, they're deposited on land. So they could be desert, they could be rivers, they could be lakes. The point is that they're on this new landmass. The other thing I should say about them, which is really, really important, is that they're what geologists call red beds. Funny term, red beds. Usually iron oxides that we find close to the Earth's surface in soils and so on are brown, rust-colored. They're hydrospheric oxides, and they're orangey or brown in color. If you're dealing with an arid environment, a dry environment, they dehydrate, they lose their water, they attach water, and they turn to the mineral hematite, which is red. And as some of you may know, hematite has been used as a pigment for thousands of years for cave drawings and things like that. Some of the cave art around Ipoh itself on the karst, prehistoric cave art, has been done with hematite. It's red. So continental red beds are red because they contain hematite, and hematite tells us that these early deposits, these Jurassic and Cretaceous rocks on this new landmass, 20 degrees north of the equator, were developed, were deposited in an arid environment. Now, if you're not convinced about that, if you'd like stronger evidence, we just have to move across the border into Thailand. And if you do that, you find in Thailand, in rocks of the same age, some of the largest salt deposits in the world. Salt deposits are obviously formed by evaporation. You can see people using that process in the Middle East, in some parts of China. You have a pan full of a large basin. I don't mean a kitchen basin. I mean a lake or some kind of lagoon, and you simply evaporate salt water in it, and you get salt. These very, very large salt deposits, these giant evaporite deposits, were formed naturally by evaporation. This could not happen in a rainforest environment. It's far too wet, far too humid. The salt would simply dissolve and be washed away. So geologically, these continental red beds, the first thing we get on the new land surface, we know from the geological evidence that they were deposited in an arid to semi-arid environment. That's I guess I should say it's carved in stone. You can't get evaporite deposits in a rainforest environment. It's impossible. Is there any other evidence that will corroborate this? It's best to have more than one line of evidence. So let's go back and look at that Ryoseki flora. We have these fossil plants let's see what they can tell us. Well, first of all, let's look at the western side of the Malaysian belt. And the problem we have there is these rocks, these continental red beds, and this is very, very confusing. The red beds are shown in dark green on this map. That's because red is usually reserved to show igneous rocks, volcanic rocks, or intrusions. So the red beds are in fact shown in dark green. There's a tiny patch here. There's a tiny patch here, right on the border with Thailand. And there's an even smaller patch over here. If any of you have been to Royal Belem, you've probably gone on a boat from the Banding Jetty past an Rangasli kampung called Tain Hain. There's a very, very small patch of these continental red beds as you go past the village or very close to the village. The problem is there's very, very little up there. The deposits are very small. So far, no significant and useful fossils, as far as I know, have been found, which tell you anything about the flora. So we have to forget evidence from the western side of the peninsula. We have to go to the east. And the first thing you'll notice is that the red beds, these dark green beds, are much more extensive. These are the beds that would deposit in that arc, in that basin over the subduction zone. They contain dinosaur footprints, but they also contain fossil plants. Now, the fossil plants they contain, we don't have a fossil forest. In some parts of the world, you have fossil forests and tourists go and look at them and the trees are big, large trunks and so on. There's nothing remotely like that. But what I want to look at are the fossils we find in these continental red beds in Pahang. This is a photograph from a paper by Smiley. And once again, University of Malaya is involved in this. Smiley was a professor of paleobotany and geology at UM in the 1970s, and that's when he did this work. So he studied the flora, the fossil flora from these continental red beds. In his first paper, he gives a very detailed description of the geology of the red beds, the kind of environments they were deposited in, rivers, streams, lakes, swamps, so those kinds of things. And then in the second paper, he talks about the taxonomy and characteristics of the plants that he found as fossils. And I'm not a paleobotanist. I'm not going to explain this. I'm going to let Smiley do it in his own words. His paper is in that long list of papers that you can find on the link. You can read it for yourselves if you want to. But down at the bottom, when he's discussing the environment that these plants grew in and what they represent, he says they all point towards an open type of forest in a climate considerably drier than that which now prevails in the Malay region. So looking at the kind of plants that we find, looking at the number of the different types of plants and so on, he says the ferns are vastly overrepresented compared to what you find in other places of the same age where the climate was damper, wetter. So he thinks it's a relatively dry, compared to today, a dry environment. The next work is Japanese paleobotanists reviewing Smiley's work. And they say clearly of the Ryoseki type, and they also conclude that the Ryoseki floras flourished under tropical or subtropical conditions with a long arid season. So again, this is consistent with the geological evidence. It was arid rather than wet. And then, again, this Prof. Morley crops up together with a Malay colleague, Shamsuddin. They worked on the pollens found in these same rocks in the 1990s. These things with strange names, Classopolis, Sounds like some dystopian city. But anyway, Classopolis, Exisi, Polentites, and so on. These are all different kinds of pollen. And they normally found in arid or extremely arid in xerophytic conditions. However, they also found pollen of ferns, pteridophytes. So they felt, based on what they found, it was probably semi-arid, but some wet conditions as well. It's a bit of a mix, but definitely not very humid, not per-humid. It's semi-arid. So again, their interpretation of the pollen types which they found suggests that conditions were dry rather than extremely wet. And finally, in this kind of resume of the climate and so on, there was a very interesting study done by Russian scientists in the 1990s and into the early 20s. It was called the Warm Earth Project. And it was particularly concerned with exactly the period that we're interested in, the Cretaceous. The Russian scientists took different stages, different ages through the Cretaceous and tried to reconstruct the world climate and make climatic maps. Now, all that research seemed to disappear for some reason. It was hard to access. It was forgotten, lost, until Hayton Flogel in 2012 brought it out of hiding, so to speak, and came up with new ideas on the Cretaceous climate. Now, I have to explain the interest in the Cretaceous. The Cretaceous was extremely warm, much warmer than anything we're experiencing now. There were no polar ice caps. There was no ice cap at the South Pole. There was no ice sheet at the North Pole. Temperatures were higher. Carbon dioxide levels were much higher. Sea levels were at least 100 meters higher than they are today. So that's why they called it the Warm Earth Research Project, or the Warm World Project. So let's look at what they found. The continents are superimposed on this as they were at the time. So the first map out of several, I chose two, is from 145 to 140 million years ago. First thing to notice is that South America and Africa are still joined together. Oh, here's South America, here's Africa. The Atlantic between them is still not open. Here is Southeast Asia. It's still quite a ways north of the equator. This dark brownish zone in the middle is the arid zone in Thailand, where we have evaporite salt deposits. Around it, you have a slightly less arid climate. Interestingly, if we go down to Australia, Australia at that time had a mid-latitude warm, humid climate. We'll come back to that later. Okay, we've now jumped towards the end. Whoops. We've now jumped towards the end of the Cretaceous. We know about 66 million years, the end of the Mesozoic. And first thing to notice, the Atlantic has opened up. Australia has moved a bit to the north. And here's India starting its journey towards Asia. But it's still south of the equator. Here's Southeast Asia still. The evaporite areas in brown, it's broken up a bit, and it's sitting in a much larger arid area. Over here, the Atlantic has opened, and we have that humid zone developing, shown in purple. And from fossil evidence, which I'm not going to spend any time on at all, it would take too long, but from fossil evidence from West Africa, you're starting to see the beginnings of a rainforest, including with flowering plants, the angiosperms. It's starting to develop over here. At the same time, Australia has also got a rainforest, as David Attenborough said, Whether or not you want to call it a tropical rainforest is kind of semantics. We can talk about that later if you like. But definitely there was a more primitive rainforest over here, without the angiosperms probably. But Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Indochina, it's still semi-arid. This paper too is in the, you can look at it on Google Drive, it's in the manuscripts. So part one, conclusion. The continental history of Peninsular Malaysia starts in the late Mesozoic, when we had uplift from beneath the sea, about 180 million years ago. The geology, i.e. the red beds and the salt deposits, and the paleontological indicators, the floras that we just looked at, suggest that the climate from 180 million years through to the end of the Mesozoic at 66 million years was arid or semi-arid. So it could not have supported a tropical rainforest. It just doesn't seem to be possible. So if that's the case, the next question is, when did the rainforest actually appear? What is its age? And that's what I want to talk about next. When are we reasonably certain that there was rainforest in Malaysia? Okay, that moves us to a different geological era. We move into the Cenozoic, which runs from 66 million years ago all the way through until today. We're going to look at it in two parts. From 66 million years to the end of the Pliocene at 2.6 million years, and then through the Pleistocene ice ages, when there were very rapid changes in the global climate, which we want to look at more carefully. Now, we have a huge problem with the first part of this. There's no data on land. Let's go to the next diagram. There we go. Back to the geological map. Cenozoic deposits on land is shown in yellow on this map. There we go. There's a one there. There's a tiny one near Kuala Kansar, which is too small to even show on this map. There's one down here somewhere, and there's some over here somewhere. So, as usual, when you've got land masses, continents, usually the geological record is very sparse. You get the best geological record usually from marine deposits over a long time in the sea. Continental deposits, there's too much erosion going on. You don't usually get a lot of evidence. These little tiny basins do contain coal deposits. Unfortunately, because the basins are so small and the deposits so limited, the correlation, the stratigraphy of them and the dating of them, it's never really been done. I'm not saying it's impossible. It probably could be done, but the time and effort it would require on these little tiny deposits hasn't been done, so we don't really know their age. We don't really know anything about the biostratigraphy or the floras that those coal deposits represent. So we have a very big problem. How do we find out when the rainforest started if there are no deposits that would actually show us that? Okay, here's the answer. We go to Petronas. And this is from Petronas's current website. It's an overview of their exploration areas in Malaysia. And what it shows are these large basins. Particularly, let's look at the Malay Basin. The surrounding area in orange is between 1,000 and 4,000 meters of sediments. And the areas in the darker orange are more than 4,000 meters of sediments. So that's an enormous thickness of sediments, and it all dates from the Cenozoic. Now, the interesting thing is, these are not marine sediments. They're sediments deposited in a lake-type environment, a large freshwater environment, which sediment was being poured into and it was accumulating. If it was a marine basin accumulating marine sediments, Petronas would have used foraminifera to establish the stratigraphy to help them to find oil and gas deposits. I mean, getting this kind of data costs probably hundreds of millions of dollars. It's very, very expensive business. But they couldn't use foraminifera. But what they could use was pollen. They used palynology to establish the stratigraphy in these basins and correlate one part of a basin to another part of a basin and so on, so that they knew what they were looking at and when it was formed and whether it was likely to contain oil or gas. The only problem with this is that the Malay Basin in particular, it's missing the first part of the Cenozoic. The Eocene, the first 40, 50 million years or so of the Cenozoic is not really represented in the Malay Basin. But starting from the Oligocene, I'll show you a stratigraphic column at one point. Starting from the Oligocene, we have this enormous thickness of sediments. And they had to do paleobotany to interpret it and find oil and gas. So they consulted paleobotanists. And the one man they consulted, or one of the men they consulted, was Professor Morley from the University of London. He is also a consultant paleobotanist. And one qualifier here, one word of caution. As I said, this data cost a lot to generate. Very, very expensive. So it's proprietary. The raw data has not been openly made available to other scientists. But because of his consultation, because of his access, Morley was allowed to use that data to make generalizations. But in a sense, that hasn't been the detailed peer review that it would be nice to have the opinion of other paleobotanists. On the other hand, Morley has published his papers, many of them, together with very reputable geologists and other scientists in excellent peer-reviewed journals. So we have to assume, or take it at this stage at least, that the data is good, the interpretation is good. So what we know about the Cenozoic, the climate, the vegetation, is derived from this offshore data as interpreted by Morley. And he has constructed in his papers maps. Let me try and get the pointer. Malaysia is somewhere here. Here is India moving northwards. This is at 60 million years, 60 million years, 50 million years. India has moved a little bit further north, 45 million years, 40 million years, 30 million years, 25 million years. And it's color-coded. Dark green indicates a per-humid climate with tropical rainforest. Lighter green, this color of green, indicates a more seasonal climate, perhaps like you have in most of Thailand nowadays. So if we look at these maps, what I've done is taken that map information and transposed it onto this diagram. This diagram is from Zagos in 2001, who talked about what happened through the Cenozoic and into the ice ages in terms of climate and ocean temperatures. So this is a temperature curve for deep water ocean water. And it's based on the isotope oxygen 18, oxygen 16 in foraminifera collected from cores, from the sediments. So that's deep ocean water temperatures. The black lines over here are glaciations. This short line here is the Arctic glaciation, and a solid black means there is an ice cap, an ice sheet. A lighter gray color means there was an ephemeral ice sheet that came and went. It wasn't there more or less continually. Over here we have the Antarctic. Same coding. Solid black means a well-developed ice cap. And what we see is looking at his maps and looking at this chart, is rainforest appearing at around 45 million years, 46 million years. I put a question mark here because the data for the early Eocene is not very good. It's not derived from the Malay Basin, it's derived from other areas, surrounding areas further away. If you want the details, for the ones among you who are botanists, one of Morley's papers, the 2018 one, has got a lot of details about the actual individual species involved and when they actually come and go. There's no way I can go into that kind of detail. So I generalized it. Based on these maps, there was rainforest from about the bottom third of the Eocene through to the start of the Oligocene at about 34 million years. There was then a noticeable drop in the temperature of the ocean. And at the same time, we got a permanent ice cap developing in the Antarctic. So it's so fascinating, this interaction between global events and presence or absence of rainforest. Here we've got an ice cap. Here we don't have any rainforest. It then warms up again in the Miocene through here, and the rainforest reappears. Things cool off. And at the end of the Pliocene, we're running into the Pleistocene Ice Age, and we'll deal with that in more detail in a few minutes. So presence or absence of rainforest is linked to global climate, and you can even link it through to whether or not there are ice caps. The reason that there may not appear to be any rainforest down here in the early parts of the Eocene is partly, as I said, lack of data. It may also be because at this time, you remember I showed you the paleomagnetic data showing the rotation of Malaysia and the way it moves southwards. At the early stages of the Eocene, it hadn't moved all that far south. It was still about 10 degrees north of the equator. Whereas if we move up here, for example, it's only 4 degrees north of the equator. So this diagram doesn't take account the change in latitude, and probably it should, but it doesn't. So the other thing that is shown on these diagrams are these arrows, and this is just a side issue. One of Morley's interests was where did plants come from and where were they going to? This arrow pointing from India towards Malaysia and towards Indonesia indicates that at that time, main migration of plant species, the flora, was from new species moving from India towards Malaysia. Same here, with a few moving back into India. So as well as telling you what the flora is, he tries to tell you where it was coming from. So these, I just knocked my microphone off. Here we go. Hope you can still hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. These are maps from 20 million years, 15 million years, 10 million years, 5 million years, 1 million year. And here's, oh, this is awkward. Let me reattach my microphone. Can you hear me still?
Yeah. Yes,
okay,
yes,
good.
Can.
Thank you. Okay, so that means I can free this hand and look at this. So this is 20 million years. This is green showing rainforest in Malaysia, Sumatra. And notice this northern boundary. To the north, we've got more seasonal forest. 15 million years, the boundary has moved slightly to the south. About the same at 10. 5 million years, it shifted further to the south, and this drying up here seems to have extended downwards, perhaps. And down here, 3 million years, where we've got definite cooling going on, we see that some seasonal vegetation, some seasonal flora is increasing. So what I'm trying to point out is that when we got climate change on this kind of time scale, it tended to be that the rainforest in the north of the peninsula, around the Thai border today, would retreat southwards if the climate became cooler and drier. When it got wetter and more humid, the forest would expand northwards. So the Malaysian rainforest through the Cenozoic would go up and down the peninsula. Okay, so I tried to summarize that here. I again dislodge my microphone. The palynological and biostratic evidence from offshore oil and gas exploration suggests that rainforest had appeared by the mid-Eocene, maybe earlier. We don't know. But then disappeared for about 10 million years during the cooling, during the Oligocene, that's in here. And then they flourish again in the warmer conditions in the Miocene before they contract in response to the global cooling in the Pliocene. So that takes us through the Cenozoic, mainly based on offshore data from hydrocarbon exploration. There's no real data from the Malaysian Peninsula landmass. What happens next? Well, the next things that happen is that we move into the late Pleistocene and Holocene sea levels changes. We're only going to look at the last 500,000 years. And what I want to point out to begin with is the totally anomalous situation that we have now. This is the present sea level here. And about 120,000 years ago, it was just as high. And over here, it was nearly as high. But these are very sharp peaks. High sea levels like the ones we have today, are quite unusual. Most of the time, sea level was much lower. Whoops. Once sea level drops below about 50 meters, if it falls 50 meters, most of the Straits of Malacca will effectively disappear. Here's the map. So we start to expose Sunderland. Here's Sumatra. Here's Peninsular Malaysia. We drop sea level by 50 meters. And Malaysia and Sumatra are connected. There are land bridges between them. If we take the last 250,000 years, 40% of the time, there were land connections between Malaysian Peninsula and Sumatra. If we drop it even further, if we drop it by the maximum it dropped was about 120 meters, this vast area is exposed, is above land, above sea level. So about 10% of the time, a little bit less than 10% of the time, Ipoh, lying around here, whoops, was actually in the middle of a very large continent. If you were in Ipoh, when the sea level was 120 meters below what it is today, you'd have to go quite a few hundred kilometers to get to the west coast of Sumatra to find a beach. And if you wanted to go to the east coast, it would be an even longer journey. So this had very important consequences for flora and fauna. As soon as you had a land bridges connecting Peninsular Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, plants and animals, could migrate across and populate those peripheral islands. Sorry, I'm having microphone problems. Okay, so it's not surprising that Sumatra, being the closest, shares more or less the same fauna as Malaysia. You've got elephants, you've got tigers, you've got leopards, you've got tigers, panthers, and so on. The fauna is very similar. The forest looks very similar. So for 40% of the time, in the last 250,000 years, they were connected. You could have walked from Lumut to Medan. And for about 10% of the time, we had this enormous continent. Malaysia was no longer a peninsula. It was in the heartland, if you like, of a very large continent known as Sunderland. So that has got to have consequences for the climate, and consequences for the climate are going to have consequences for the rainforest. So this is a model. It was some computer modeling done by Reyes et al. Malaysians were involved in this, offering their expertise on dipterocarps and what it took for them to flourish. Here's the model for the present. And you can see that it's hard to make out, but here we have Batu Caves. This is Malaysia. It's colored mostly dark blue and green, indicating quite a lot of dipterocarp species in the hundreds, low hundreds, 100 or so. If we go back to the lowest sea level, the last glacial maxima, about 20,000 years ago, the map is completely different. In this particular model, it's almost white. The dipterocarps have nearly disappeared, and it's very similar to what you find in Thailand, Cambodia, and so on at that time. Something rather drastic has happened according to that model. If you look at this model, different assumptions, it's not as drastic a change, but there is still a loss of dipterocarp richness. So loss of sea level at these very low stands of sea level, when it dropped below 100 meters, when it fell, resulted in a loss of many dipterocarp species. But that's only a model. And I think when you model something, you want to have field evidence to try and verify it. So this is work by Heaney. Again, Heaney proposed a model called the Savannah Corridor. This is a summary by Bird of what the evidence is at the time of the last glacial maxima. And again, Bird's paper is in that long list that I gave you that's on the link. Open symbols indicate it wasn't a forest at the last glacial maxima. Black symbols indicate that it is forest. And you can see Peninsular Malaysia, the data from the west coast area, western side of the peninsula, which is where the data is from, suggests that it was not rainforest at the time of the last glacial maxima, 120 meters sea level down. These shaded areas are the Savannah Corridor defined by Heaney in 1991. Heaney was a zoologist. He spent many, many years working in the Philippines. He worked for the, maybe still as far as I know, for the Field Museum in Chicago. And he was one of the first people to propose a savanna hypothesis, that the rainforest was replaced by savanna. Now, I think he was, as I said, he was a zoologist. I think botanists have a problem with calling it a savanna. Probably, strictly speaking, it might not have been a savanna, not like the savannas in Africa, not mainly grassland. That may not have been as extreme as it went. But definitely there was a change in the forest type during those very, very low sea level periods. So let's look at the field evidence. We're going to go, first of all, and just look at Site 15, which is very close to KL. Here's the data from Site 15. Again, Morley's name comes up. This is very close, or was very close, it's no longer there. It was very close to Subang Airport site. Look at the pollen. This is a record of the pollen that they found at this particular site near the present-day Subang Airport. Nearly 40% of the pollen is from pine trees, from pinus species. There's also a fairly large grass component, but it's the pinus one that's important, perhaps. You cannot find pines in the strict sense, pinus species, growing naturally in Malaysia today. They only appear when the climate is cooler. You can find them growing on top of mountains in Sumatra. And I think in southern Sumatra is the only place where you actually find pinus growing south of the equator. They never crossed that divide, and they never established themselves on, say, Mount Kinabalu. No pinus, didn't get over there. So to find pinus, you have to go either a fair ways north, or you've got to go to the high mountains in Sumatra. It indicates a cooler, drier climate. It must have been radically different to what we have today. So that's one of those sites on the map. The other evidence I want to show you is more recent. This researcher, Worcester, and his colleagues came up with a very clever way of figuring out the proportion of grassland to treed land. What they do is look at the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in samples taken from guano in caves. And you might think, why on earth, how does that help? Well, it turns out that if you look at the carbon-13, carbon-12 ratio in grasses, it goes from -9 to -16. In trees, it goes from -19 to -34. So apparently grasses and trees have a different way of metabolizing carbon, which is what causes this difference. So this is the idea. This box represents the idea, the concept they had. You have vegetation. We want to get an average estimate of the carbon ratio in the carbon isotope ratios. Well, insects eat vegetation. Bats eat insects. And bats then go into cave and poop. So if you take guano and do isotopic analysis of it, carbon isotopes, you get an aggregate, you get a ratio of the proportion of grass versus trees for some kind of radius around the site. And bats can fly many kilometers at night to get their food. They can fly very large distances, tens of kilometers, depending on what kind of bats they are, of course. So this is the data from Batu Caves, site 15. Whoops. This is before the last glacial maxima. The last glacial maxima about 25,000 years ago. The ratio is over here on the right-hand side of this over here. You can see it starts off at about -22, and then after the glaciation, it drops down. Actually, I should say it drops up. It goes more negative. Let's get this right. It goes from -20 to -28. So it's moving in the direction of more trees. In the cooling down before the last glacial maxima, grasses are a higher proportion than they are afterwards. Worcester has now repeated this experiment in various places around Sunderland and found other places where you get this kind of trend. There's a paper came out 2019, I think, showing something similar in Kalimantan. So again, that's a new line of evidence of this increased grassland when cooler, drier periods were coming. So what I want to do now is very quickly run through a few slides, which are my ideas now on what perhaps the transition looked like. What actually happened? What did the vegetation look like when this change was going on, when you move through one of those glacial cycles from the high present sea level down by 120 meters to a cooler, drier climate, because it's a continental climate rather than a maritime climate. This is Kledang Forest just outside Ipoh. Typical rainforest, cabbage, cauliflower type canopy. If you go down underneath, quite dark, not a lot of undergrowth. If you go up to Thailand, this is taken about midway between Bangkok and Chiang Mai. There are still dipterocarps, but it's a much more open forest. You can see the sky from down below quite easily. There's quite a lot of grass, so more open. The trees are smaller. This is if you move to eastern Cambodia on the Vietnamese border. It's still a dipterocarp forest. This is a Dipterocarpus tuberculatus. These leaves are actually the leaves of a dipterocarp tree. Very strange. But you can see the trees are quite small. There's lots and lots of grass. And the climate is very different. You're familiar with the climate around Kledang. If you went to eastern Cambodia, it's dry from December through till sometime in May. I mean, when I say dry, I mean completely dry in this part of Cambodia. You will not get even a rain shower usually. Very, very unusual to get rain in that period. It's very hot, it's very dry. Sometime in May into June, the rains come, they're torrential. And this area becomes completely impassable, even if you're using an elephant. It's very, very difficult to get around. You need a helicopter. The whole area gets flooded. We're talking about a very large area too. It just becomes impassable. So extremely seasonal. 5 months dry, and then about 5 months wet, and a couple of months which is really neither. And at the extreme, this is what I would call savanna, almost entirely grassland. This is the Soa Basin in Flores. And this blue top here is a dig by Professor Morwood from Australia and his colleagues, the people that found Homo floresiensis and Flores. And here they're digging up fossils of various kinds, stegodonts and things like that. I don't think in Malaysia during these cold periods it got that extreme. I don't think we had that kind of vegetation. But that's certainly a possibility, I think. So why am I doing this? Why am I telling you this? Well, if you go to Kledang today, there's something missing. You can hear siamang, you can see siamang, but there's one animal that you can't find there that you would expect to find. It's a perfectly good rainforest. You find the animal in Sumatra, you find it in Borneo, but you're not going to find it on Kledang. It's the orangutan. Orangutans appear to have completely disappeared from Southeast Asian mainland shortly before, during, or maybe just after the last glacial maximum. Now, orangutans are the most arboreal of the great apes. They spend most of their lives in trees, and the habitat they're adapted for is closed canopy tropical rainforest. That's what they normally live in. If you brought them back, I'm not saying that you should, but if you brought them back, they'd probably be okay on Kledang today. But if you were on Kledang 30,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, you would probably have heard orangutans as well as siamang. And why do I say that? Well, here's a map showing distribution of orangutans. They evolved late in the Pliocene up in northern Vietnam, Indochina, southern China. But they're found throughout mainland Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, all the way down into Malaysia. Now I must thank various people. I have to thank Dr. Rose Fatia from and her colleague Lim Shen, and a whole lot of very enthusiastic cavers who've been working in the Kinta Valley, and they keep finding orangutan teeth. So we know that orangutans were around, which is why I am pretty confident that you would have heard them at least if you were on Kledang 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. Before that, they'd only been known from Lengong and from Batu Caves. Now they're being found in the Kinta Valley and at other places in the peninsula. So to me, the disappearance of the orangutan, an arboreal creature, is an indicator that the last glacial maxima did have major consequences for the orangutans and for the forest. Something dramatic happened to the forest that prevented the orangutans thriving and surviving, and they simply disappeared. The rest of the animals that you can find in most of Southeast Asia, the elephants, the tigers, the leopards, and so on, they're adapted to savannas, they can live in rainforest. They're much more kind of cosmopolitan, they're much less specialized. So to me, the disappearance of the orangutan indicates that the hypothetical changes in the rainforest during the LGM were in fact pretty significant. Not as significant as the meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs, but nevertheless a very significant event. And you would find similar things happening with other species. For example, herpetologists working on snakes in Malaysia have linked the distribution and the molecular biology of snakes from the mountaintops like Fraser's Hill, Cameron Highlands, Bukit Larut, and so on, to the fact that Malaysia cooled down during the LGM. The lower temperature zone moved down the mountains, the snakes moved down, and they could intermix. So apparently, it appears that molecularly, looking at the molecular biology, they're more similar than you would expect than if they'd been kept separate for the whole time through the Pleistocene. They're more similar to each other than would be expected. And that can be explained by a larger cool zone that they could live in. They move down, they can interbreed. They don't change as much as they should have because of the changing climate. When the climate warmed up again, some of those snakes that like cooler environments moved into caves. They found refuge in caves, and they stayed down at low elevations, but they became cave-dwelling species. So you can see it in the herpetology. You can see similar things for many species.
Ecology.
Okay. So what about the orangutans? Well, that slide is there. I've kind of gone through it and I tried to explain it. Why didn't the orangutans come back when sea level went up again? Well, if you look at what happens after these lows, when sea level was low, it goes up extremely rapidly. You have a long period of low sea levels and then a very rapid rise. Very rapid rise. So these rises are very, very rapid here, here, here. So it seems likely that the rainforest in, say, the Straits of Malacca was very quickly inundated. It was inundated before rainforest was reestablished on the Peninsular mainland. And so by the time rainforest had come back, Straits of Malacca, the land bridges had disappeared and the orangutans couldn't get back. That's my idea anyway. Okay, how long have I been talking? Too long. Let me try and wrap some things up, just a few more minutes. Are the rainforests similar today? Okay, last week I was in Perlis, we were in Perlis. Perlis, the average amount of annual rainfall is about 1,500 millimeters. It's well established and recognized that the rainforests in Perlis are not really rainforests. I shouldn't say rainforests. They're transitional to the more monsoonal, more seasonal forests that you find in Thailand. That is recognized. That 1,500 millimeters of rain per year is less rain than you have to qualify to be a rainforest. It just isn't enough. And you can see that looking at the forest, it's different. If we go to Royal Bellum, of course, which is also quite a long way north on the Thai border, but not quite as far north as Perlis, I found some historical data for a number of years at Tan Hain, which is that Orang Asli Kampung that I mentioned that you go past on the boat if you're going up the lake. occasionally, and this is very occasionally, they get less than 1,500 millimeters, 2,000 millimeters, sorry. In 2009, 2010, they only got 1,922. Most years they would get 2,000 or more, but some years they get less. And there are 3 months with rainfall less than 60 millimeters. So it's not obvious like it is in Perlis, but the rainforest in Rorobellum is also in a kind of transitional zone. It's still a rainforest. You can't take 1 year and say it's not a rainforest. Trees obviously live for hundreds, if not thousands of years. There's going to be a long lag. The climate has got to change for a long time period before the nature of the forest would immediately change. In contrast, if you go to Kuala Tahan, Taman Negara, the rainfall is usually well over 2,200 millimeters. So the further north you are, the more sensitive the rainforest is to climate change. The further south you are, the closer to the equator, in other words, probably the less sensitive it is in general. Okay, going back to the age and then wrapping up, I'm starting to wrap up here. If rainforests were absent from Peninsular Malaysia in the late Mesozoic, how old are they? And really, I don't think this is terribly important. I don't think we should define rainforest by age. We can say when a species started or disappeared, that's fine. But rainforest, you get into semantics. It's not really a useful discussion. But we can say that rainforest first appeared sometime in the lower Eocene. It was too arid at the end of the Cretaceous for a rainforest to have existed. So at 150, 180 million years, not possible. And at the end of the Cretaceous at 66 million years, still not possible to have a rainforest. So sometime between 66 and 40 something, rainforest appeared based on that offshore data. It disappeared again in the Oligocene. Well, I don't know how you would handle it, but with a gap of 10 million years, is this rainforest the same as that rainforest? Or is this a new rainforest? You could say this is the age, you could say that's the age, and then you get up to the Pleistocene when you've got this oscillation, the rainforest coming and going several times because of the global climatic oscillations and glacial periods. And it becomes a pointless kind of discussion, I think. What is important is to recognize these changes and the significance for the flora and fauna. That's the main thing. And by all means, put dates on the changes. We should try and do that to the best of our ability. But not worry too much about, oh, the rainforest is the oldest. No, it isn't. I don't want to get involved in that too much. I don't think it's a very productive discussion. So, nevertheless, and I think I've got one more slide after this, so you can start getting your questions ready if you do have any. If you go on Google and Google the world's oldest rainforest, putting the oldest rainforest in quotes, and world's youngest rainforest, you get quite a lot of hits for the world's oldest rainforest. People are clearly interested in that topic. It does get hits. But as I just said, I don't think it's a particularly relevant thing, scientifically at least. And I think it gives rise to a misperception, a misunderstanding. When you say the rainforest is X years old, people tend to think it's been there all the time. It's never changed. There was, in fact, a book written in the, I think in the early 1980s by Charles Shuttleworth. Malaysia's Green and Timeless World was the title. And I think that's not right. I hope if I've convinced you of one thing, apart from when the rainforest started, the one thing I would hope I convince you of is Malaysian rainforest was certainly not timeless. It disappeared in the Oligocene. It came and went in the Pleistocene. We can relate changes in both flora and fauna to those events. So it isn't green and timeless. It's a continual change. And it's particularly true that in Malaysia, because it's surrounded by sea, Straits of Malacca, South China Sea on the other side, and because during global cooling that sea disappears, Peninsular Malaysia goes from being a peninsula to being deep in the interior of a continent. It's and that makes it very, very sensitive to these kinds of effects. I'm going to go back and just show you this slide. I told you this was in eastern Cambodia, just on the Vietnamese border. 5 months dry every year, guaranteed. This site is only 200 kilometers from the South China Sea. It's not very far at all. You would have to travel further than that when Ipoh was in a continental area during low sea levels. You'd have to travel about 300-400 kilometers to get to the sea on the west side of Sumatra. The reason is the mountains, the Annamite Mountains. This area is in the rain shadow. It's not even a particularly high mountain range. But because of those mountains, it's extremely dry. There's a very, very long dry season. So topography is important. And all of that influences fauna and flora. Now, just for the last slide, and then if you have questions, you can start to ask them. Last slide. A kind of interesting way to finish, I thought. There is actually a website called www.paleolocation.org. So you can go into that website and you can choose your hometown, or I chose Ipoh, and you can ask where it was X million years ago. It's not a fun site, it's a real site. It uses the best available geological reconstruction of where the various plates were and gives you the latitude and longitude for that location at the date you specify. It doesn't actually give you the exact date. It goes to the best reconstruction available that's closest to that date. So here's the date, here's the latitude, here's the longitude. 500 million years ago, Ipoh was just south of the equator at longitude 127. The longitudes don't change a lot, but the latitudes change enormously from -31 to +31 at 180 million years. So going back to what we know about the geology, I've colored these first three dates in blue because you'd either be on a ship or we'd be having this meeting in a submarine or we'd be wearing diving equipment. At that time, the little bit of crust that Ipoh is on would have been marine. It would have been under the sea. Then we have uplift at around 200 million years when the Malaysian Subumasu collided with the southern edge of Asia. Whoops. And we get an arid zone from about 200 to 100 million years. 29, 30 degrees north. And then because of India colliding with Asia, we start to swing clockwise and the latitude starts to drop. Starting around 100 million years, we've gone from 31 to 14.5. We get to 45 million years, the latitude is decreasing. We're moving into the equatorial zone. And then here we get these transitions between glaciers, higher sea levels, glaciation again, higher sea levels again. And we get periods when it was rainforest, as it is now. And we get other periods when the climate is drier and cooler. And we're in the middle of a continent rather than being close to the sea. And we get probably a more seasonal forest, like the forest that we get in